Hello, and welcome back to our 14th live stream on ancient Egypt and the Bible. And in this live stream, what we do is we take your questions and we try to answer them. And this being the 14th live stream, we've named this particular live stream after the Egyptian myth, the contentions of Horus and Seth. And in that Egyptian mythology, when Osiris is killed by his brother Seth, his body is chopped up into 14 pieces, and those pieces are spread out all over Egypt. So today's episode is a reference to that Egyptian myth. So anyway, we're going to get started here. And like always, if you are super chats will take priority. They always do. And if you're not doing a super chat and you still want to ask me a question, please start your question with a Q and a colon. And I do try to get it fit in as many non-super chats as I can. But I also request that you only post your question once, so I know whether or not I've actually taken it, or if it's a new question. So with that said, let's get into it. The first question is actually not a super chat, but this was posted several days ago on the chat, and I thought it was a great question. I really actually like this question, but because it disappears, I have to take it pretty fast. So let's see here. I'm going to take off the Twitch chat here. And this is by Reginald O'Donoghue. Should Mayen mi Neptoach in Joshua 18:15 be translated as the spring of Merneptah? This is a fascinating question because for hundreds and for almost 2,000 or more years, this particular passage has been translated as the spring of the waters of Neptua. Okay. However, there's some issues with that translation. Even so, you still find it in modern Bibles, that spring of the waters of Neptua. The issues are that, well, spring and waters is a redundancy. You just don't find that redundancy normally in Hebrew. The second problem is Neptoa doesn't make much sense. It doesn't have a Semitic root. It's a very, very strange word. Today, scholars pretty much accept that Mian Mi Neptoa is actually the spring of Merneptah. So yes, indeed, it should be translated as the spring of Merneptah, which is named after the successor of Ramses II. Now, interestingly enough, this might not be the only town in the Bible that's named after Merneptah. A recent proposal has suggested that Kadesh Barnea might actually also be named after Merneptah. In languages, you sometimes get metathesis, and it actually happens more frequently than most people realize in Hebrew, where two consonants will switch position to make it easier to say, or for some odd linguistic reason. But it's possible that Barnea may have undergone metathesis and might have been originally pronounced Banare. So Kadesh Banare. So basically the Kadesh of Merneptah, Banare being the throne name of Merneptah. So there's also a possibility that there's a second town in the Bible that's named after Merneptah. So I definitely think that your question is a good question. It's spot on. And frankly, if you look in, say, the lexicons like Halot would agree with this suggestion that it is the spring of Merneptah. So anyway, that was a great question. Even though not a super chat, I wanted to address it because I think it was a fantastic question, and it does show sort of the interaction between the Bible and Egypt. So anyway, let's get right into the super chats now. So our first super chat is, I need to start that and restart it. It's not connecting. Connect. And turn on Twitch chat. Okay, I just lost that connection. So I'm gonna have to just read this one. 499 super chat from Michael Serber. Hi, Dr. Falk. Are there any Egyptian texts speaking of plagues? I heard Titus Kennedy speaking about some evidence that supports one or two of them. Okay. I've got a few issues here with how Kennedy handles this evidence. There are texts, especially Middle Kingdom texts, that talk about unusual events that really strongly resemble some of the plagues that we find in the book of Exodus. The problem is that they are really, really early texts compared to when the Exodus actually happened. Most of those texts date to the 12th dynasty. That's hundreds of years or before the Exodus, even if you were going by an early date. Now, what those texts will mention is stuff like the sun being blackened, the river turning to blood, Asiatics invading the land. You know, there's lots of these little sort of hints, and I think they are evidence of the Exodus plagues, but they're not quite what Titus Kennedy suggests. Now, what Titus wants to do is he wants to take all those texts and redate them to the 18th dynasty. And I don't think that's possible. I think that's a silly suggestion and shows that he doesn't know anything about actually the textual concerns of, say, the Papyrus of Ephraim or Nefertiti or the other Middle Kingdom polemic texts, the Middle Kingdom prophetic texts. They're sometimes called too. So, and I think this really is damaging because there's really no question that these texts are from the Middle Kingdom. You won't find really an Egyptologist out there that will think that these texts come from anywhere other than the Middle Kingdom, unless he's been really badly trained, which can happen. You know, people do slip through the cracks. But I think what those texts are really showing is that there are these natural events that are that happen during the regular inundation cycle in Egypt. And what happened is that what you had during the year of the Exodus was a really, really severe version of these otherwise natural events. So I think they're evidence that they showed that these kinds of events did happen in Egypt's history. So I think in that respect, it's actually really good evidence for the plagues. But I also won't take Titus Kennedy's reading either because of the problems it presents. So anyway, that's a great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it.
What are the most types of super chats?
Oh, okay. Sorry? I can't hear you.
The super chat disappeared.
Oh, why did his super chat disappear?
Warrior of the Most High, do you still have?
Most High. I do not have Warrior of the Most High's super chat. I don't even see it. Sorry, but I don't know. The next super chat I see is by Tom Wanchik. Oh, yeah. One of the problems with super chats is if they're posted really much before the live cast, the live stream. YouTube tends to drop them, and I can't really retrieve them to post them again. It's very difficult to do. So, when I look at the viewer activity here, I see. Yeah, I see 3 super chats on there. The others, if there were others, they dropped off. So unfortunately, if I don't catch them during the week, it's really difficult for me to capture them all. So that is just a heads up. So if you are going to post a super chat ahead of time of the live stream, it's a really good idea to let me know or give me some advanced warning that you're going to do that, so I can actually catch it. But you can do that on, say, the messages below, or just give me some indication that they're coming. So I'm sorry, Warrior of the Most High, if I missed your super chat. But post the question and we'll do our best to answer it. Okay, but we're gonna move on here. Okay, Tom Wamcheck for $5. Thank you very much. What are resources on the Exodus you would recommend for kids aged 8 to 12? Ooh, that's a tough one, because there is a gap there. There is a lacuna there. My wife and I actually proposed writing a children's book on the Exodus, and we pitched it to a publisher, and they didn't see a market for it. So much of this is as much convincing the publisher that there's a need, as much as providing the resource. So it's very difficult to publish a book on this, which is both accurate, informative, and written at the appropriate level. Now, we've got some experience writing materials at that level, but we also have difficulty convincing publishers that people would be interested in this. So I can't recommend a good resource on this. There's just isn't one at the moment. But it's not going to stop us from trying again. We will probably try again at some point. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Hey. Gizgo SBOL for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Was there decline during the reign of Tutmosis II? I just pull up something here before I continue here, usually. Okay. All right. Tutmosis II is okay. Tutmosis II was essentially a young king. He came to the throne. I don't think there was any sort of decline during the reign of Tutmosis II. If anything, it looks like the nation, the new kingdom, was sort of going from strength to strength at this point. This is very early on in the New Kingdom period. It hasn't actually, the New Kingdom at this point, it doesn't even reach its height yet. So, if anything, I'd say during the reign of Tutmosis II, what we're seeing is actually a rising action, not a decline. So, I don't think there was a decline during the reign of Tutmosis II, but he did have a few problems at the beginning of his reign, like he had to deal with revolts. But every king in Egypt had to deal with revolts. Every time a new king comes to the throne, they have to go on campaign to show the vassal states who's in charge. And Tutmosis II was actually relatively young when he came to the throne, so he couldn't personally go out on campaign. So he had to send generals in his stead to go out and bash a few skulls just to prove who was king. So we do have his stela from the Nubian revolt, and that's very telling because he sends out his generals. They restore order, and then they bring back some captives back to Tutmosis II, where he can personally, from his throne wood, symbolically at least, put a foot on the neck of one of the captives. So that was one of those sort of acts that you see it happen during his reign. So it's not an act you see recorded often, but because he was so young, it was sort of a very extraordinary thing. So there is some things that are a little different about Tutmosis II's reign, but it no means a decline. Anyway, thank you for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Okay, I hope this is your question, Warrior of the Most High. Was the first chapter of Genesis written during the exile? No. In all likelihood, it was Genesis, at least the source materials, was written during the Iron Age. Or sorry, not the Iron Age, the Late Bronze Age. So, at least the sources that we have seem to suggest that it was it. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't influenced by Babylonian sources and Mesopotamian sources. And part of the reason why there is that sort of interplay between Genesis 1 and, say, Mesopotamian myths like Enuma Elish, Enki and the Magic Hoe, and all these other sort of Mesopotamian myths, and even to some extent like Gilgamesh. But it's also has influence too from Egyptian sources as well. We see the Memphite theology play a very, very sort of key role in Genesis. So, there's a huge number of sources that went into Genesis 1. So I don't think it's correct that critical scholars have suggested that it was written during the exile. But I think the original sort of pericope, the core pericope of Genesis 1 was written sometime during the Late Bronze Age. And I would even suggest that it was probably written in the years during Moses, or maybe just slightly after. And I think a lot of the reason why Genesis exists as a book, to be very, very honest, is to galvanize the idea of the one nation of Israel out of the mixed multitude. Because we have to remember, when the Israelites left Egypt, they left with a huge contingent of other nations. You had all sorts of people in the mix. You had Magi, you had Nubians, you had Egyptians, you had Libyans, you had other Canaanites, you had all these different people. And each of them had their own creation myth. Each of them brought with them their own understandings of God and creation. And the quickest way to galvanize that is to give them a new creation account. And this is not to say it's cut out of whole cloth, but it's just to say that the impetus to write that first chapter is most desperately needed when you have the greatest diversity of population. So I think this is a very, very important consideration, and the reason why you have so many different creation myths in conversation here with Genesis 1. So anyway, I think that was a great question. Thank you for asking it. Okay. Super chat from Matthew Harrell for $5. Thank you very much. You probably answered these, but why were Jews not allowed to cut the sides of their heads? Were kosher rules meant to parallel how Egyptians ate? A lot of it was in a reaction to it. Some of it was to differentiate themselves. Like, for example, the kosher law for against eating pork. Now, here's the thing: Egyptians also didn't eat pork. However, Canaanites did. So this is one of those sort of prohibitions that was kept because it would make them distinct from the native Canaanites. So a lot of these laws, especially the kosher laws, the laws of unmixed fabric, cleanliness laws, a lot of these were designed to make Israel a distinct and unique nation, set apart. You know, give them that strong definition of categories. In Israelite culture, you have 4 categories. Okay, you've got holy. That's your purest category. Okay, that's even one step above clean. Holy things were meant to be used in the presence of God. Then you had clean, and the opposite, of course, being unclean. We can probably better understand clean and unclean as more of like normal and abnormal. So it has more of that connotation of things being normal versus being abnormal. Sometimes one had to do unclean things, which were probably abnormal, like touching a corpse, touching a dead animal. That made you ritually unclean, in which case you'd had to go through like, for example, if you got attacked by a lion and you killed the lion in your own self-defense, well, now you're ritually unclean because you touched the corpse of the lion in defending yourself. So that made you ritually unclean, and you had to go through a purification ritual to resolve that. Now, there's also a 4th category, which is what the Israelites called toevo, or toeva. It means abomination. This is the worst of the worst. This is you don't ever do this for any reason whatsoever. And it is really the strongest negative connotation in Israelite culture. So I think much of what these laws did was help to establish these 4 categories within Israelite culture, so that they could make themselves a people that were distinct from, say, their neighbors. So it's a great question, and I would say, does this even include, say, that that they couldn't cut what's called the corner of their beard? Really, their sideburn. They just let the sideburn grow. So there's no reason for that culturally other than to make a distinction. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Kwame Adu for 007 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. What is your general dating for the Exodus? 1265 BC. Is the date of Amenhotep Kopshef's death helpful in the dating of Exodus at all? Yeah, it is actually. I am going to do a video on Amenhotep Kopshef when I find the time, which is, be honest, this month has been really, really busy for me. I've had a lot of deadlines, a lot of things to do. I've been running ragged. So, but that is one of the videos for the day for the evidence of the Exodus that I want to get out. Amenhotep Kopshef dies in roughly the 25th year of the reign of Ramses II. And for those of you who don't know, Amenhotep Kopshef was the crown prince. He was in his day, he was a big deal. This was really important. He was the crown prince of Ramses II. He was the firstborn son. He was the successor. He was also Egypt's chief diplomat. You know, he was important, and he was old. He was an adult already at the time of his death. So he had a lot of responsibility, and he was apparently very well liked and was actually very successful as a diplomat. So it is helpful. I wish we had the exact date of his death, but we know it's roughly around the 25th regnal year. So give or take, 3-5 years maybe, and you're in that sort of ballpark for when the Exodus would have taken place. Now, I do think that that you can't just say that that's the absolutely the identifying mark of when the Exodus takes place, because there is always the possibility that another son was made prince afterwards and then died shortly after, maybe 10 years after. So you can only say from this that the Exodus at the earliest would have been around that year. But I think given all the time frames involved with the Merneptah stela, I think 1265 is a really good option, and I think Amenhotep Kopshef helps to confirm that. So thank you very much for the super chat, very much appreciated, and let's go on to the next question. Okay, Matthew Harrellian for $15. Wow, thank you very much for that super chat. Is Adam and Eve meant to parallel Middle Eastern myths like Ninhursag, Enki, Shamhat, Enkidu, Gilgamesh, Ishtar's tree, Gilgamesh and the fruit of life, and a snake, Adapta, South Wind, or are they unique? Well, that's a very interesting question. There are some parallels between Gilgamesh and the Adam and Eve narrative. Is it a parallel? That's also another question. That's really a difficult one to resolve. Now, I don't think it's a copy of these myths. I mean, I don't buy the mythicist line at all, because I don't think the similarity does not imply ontology. So just because something is similar does not mean that one came from the other. So you can't just say that there's a direct descent there. But I do think that, one of the things about Genesis is it is really in this sort of dialogue with a lot of different myths and religions, and in many ways it's trying to set the record straight. It's trying to give you this sort of, well, where did it all come from in respect to who was responsible? So it's not so much trying to tell you, how the earth was created. It's more to tell you who created the earth. Okay, so that's really what Genesis is driving at, and it's that who and that relationship and that whole sort of temple ideology, that symbolism that's happening in Genesis 1-3, that's really, really important when we read those chapters. So there is an interaction with those things. It's not necessarily a parallel, but it is trying to give you a start to see where the trajectory of Yahweh is coming from, Elohim is coming from. That's really what it's meant to do. It in many ways tries to replace theogony, which is the birth of the gods, with cosmogony, which is the creation of the world, the creation of the cosmos. So it's the Adam and Eve part is trying to give you a different sort of viewpoint than what the other myths are giving you. So it is acting like its own polemic. It's very much acting like its own polemic, and those myths are distinct from that polemic. So they are unique, but they are in conversation as well. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for that super chat, and I very much appreciate it. Okay, that looks like the end of the super chats. So let's look at for some non-super chats. Okay. I'll take this one. I've seen you post that in videos, estimating the date of Exodus at 1260. Why then is Ramses' reign dated from 1279 to 1213? Okay. The reason is because of chronology, and that's a big subject to talk about, chronology. The 1279 to 1213 dates come from Kitchen's low chronology. Now, chronology is something that's always unfolding. So we get new pieces of data that come along every now and then. There's a better chronology that's come out in, say, I'd say the 2000s, which is more of a low middle chronology that dates his reign from 1288. And I forget the terminus date was. That here, look it up here. 1288 to 1222. Okay, so a lot has changed in chronology in just even the last 10 years. People are now using computer analytics for chronology, and this has increased the accuracy of chronology just by leaps and bounds. I mean, it's just crazy how much is now involved in, say, the discipline of chronology. Really, you can't even do chronology without a good, powerful computer anymore. I don't think, and I think while people are still doing it by hand, it's a really dumb idea to do. But I think in, say, 20 years, I don't think anyone will be doing chronology anymore by hand, just because of the power of modern computers and their abilities to do the calculations involved. So that's why you're seeing those reigns. It's an older set of numbers for the reign of Ramses II. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Okay. Going to take, let's see. I'll take that one. From Rufus John. Question: what are your thoughts on Eric Klein's 1177 BCE, the year civilization collapsed? Okay. Now I honestly haven't read the book. I should have read the book, but I haven't. I know Eric. He's a nice guy. He's a real nice guy. And I did give him a hard time once during a question answer survey on a paper he gave. So I do feel a little guilty for that. So, but I do think that the book does sort of lead people to come to a certain perception of the late Bronze Age collapse that isn't quite accurate. Now, I don't deny that there was a late Bronze Age collapse. He actually dates it to 1184, but publisher wanted a more catchy title, so he renamed it to the publisher suggested it be renamed to 1177. But 1184 is his real date. Now, my problem with his hypothesis is that the collapse started hundreds of years before and ended hundreds of years after. It wasn't just one collapse. It was many events, and it was a sort of a progression. So that's my thought on it. But I think there is something to the hypothesis, and I think there was a collapse event that took place. It's just stretched out over a much longer period of time. For example, Egypt itself doesn't enter into its sort of phase of this collapse until, say, it starts during the reign of Merneptah, but it goes into full collapse by Ramses IV. Even Ramses III, there's already riots and inflation and all that going on in Egypt. So that's what I think is happening here as far as the Bronze Age collapse is concerned. So thank you very much for the question. Okay. Okay, I'll take this one from Marcy Powell. If what do we have a super chat? Okay. Okay, I'll take this one, then I'll take the super chat. If Merneptah was for Pharaoh by the time that Israel arrived in Canaan, wouldn't the Israelites have been in the wilderness for over 40 years? Okay, a couple things we need to understand about that 40 years. The 40 years is not an exact number; it's an idiom. 40 years is a undefined length of time. So it could have been 40 years. It could have been 37 years. It could have been 65 years. They were not being necessarily precise when you ever see, because you'll see the 40 years recur over and over and over and over again, because 40 is an idiom that means an indeterminate span. Now, they are more careful about their units. So, for example, 40 days is also the same sort of deal. You know, if they want a really long time, they'll multiply that 40 with something else. So they have a ways of expressing a little bit of the magnitude, but 40 itself is an idiomatic expression. So that presents a difficulty right there. The second thing is that if the timing of Merneptah and arriving in Canaan would have been in his first probably 2, maybe 3 regnal years. So it's pretty early on in his reign. At that point in time, Israel would have just have established its presence. It would have just sort of started its basically the conquest in Israel goes through 2 phases. They enter into the promised land, destroy Jericho, destroy Ai, basically, and destroy Hatzor, basically the big mean cities. They take care of those first. So they wipe out, say, the major roadblocks to the conquest, and then they gather and they then divide the land. And after they divide the land amongst themselves, it becomes incumbent upon each tribe to secure their own inheritance. Okay, so what I think is going on is they've already got their foothold in Canaan at that point by the time Merneptah invades. But they are at that point just either dividing the inheritance, or they are starting to secure it. Okay, so it's really early on in the phase of Israel's history. So it's sort of in that point where they're just beginning the conquest. So it doesn't, at that point, you would expect them to have been in the promised land already for a few years. So thank you very much for the question. Very interesting. Okay, let's go to that next super chat. Okay. Matthew Harrell for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Here's a dumb question. Oh, come on. The only dumb question I have ever heard is, Professor, is that going to be on the test? Yes, that's a dumb question. Any other question isn't dumb. Yes, okay. Did the aliens build the pyramids? That's also a dumb question. Okay, I'll admit that. All right. Is there actually a difference between Assyriology and Egyptology, or is there interdialogue between the two? Yes, there's actually quite a bit of difference between the two. Now, they are parallel fields. They are parallel specializations. Okay. Occasionally there's dialogue, but there really isn't. We don't actually see a lot of dialogue between Egyptologists and Assyriologists, but there are some. There is some dialogues. Like, for example, Alan Millard is a very good friend of mine. I enjoy his company greatly. He's a great guy, and he's now a retired Assyriologist. So, but it isn't a field that you do. The two fields don't actually overlap much. My other good friend, Richard Averbeck, also an Assyriologist. And we'll talk quite a bit. You know, he's also a great guy. So there can be dialogue between these two fields. It just doesn't happen very often because they're sort of in silos. And anytime you get siloed information, they tend to go by their own standards. Now, I try to interact more with other fields because I have a broader interest in the ancient Near East as well. So I probably am in more contact with some of these people more than most, say, Egyptologists would be. But there is actually a difference in methodological approaches and, say, how we approach the data, the texts we use, what kind of texts are available to us. Like, for example, you know, in Assyriology, most of the texts you will encounter are actually receipts, like purchase receipts. Like you bought a donkey, and here's your receipt to prove you own the donkey. In Egyptology, most of the texts we deal with are religion texts, you know, texts we find in temples. So there is going to be a difference in, say, you know, textual analysis. You're also going to find that there's also going to be differences in the way we do, say, languages, because Akkadian, the primary language used in Assyriology, there's also some Sumerian as well, but you'll also see in Akkadian that there's no real special determinatives. They do have determinatives, but it doesn't have, say the range of meaning. So, for example, a Assyriologist can translate their Akkadian texts into, or transliterate them into a sort of an English kind of transliteration, and they can read that perfectly fine, and it makes complete sense to them. Whereas as an Egyptologist, you know, you do a transliteration, you kind of go, okay, I'm missing some nuance here. Can I see the original hieroglyphs? Because the hieroglyphs can give me some nuance that disappears once it's transliterated. So there's going to be those sorts of differences. There's also going to be some archaeological differences as well. Like, for example, you know, there's a lot of material culture that's preserved in Egypt that isn't preserved in Mesopotamia. For example, you know, we find so much because of the dry desert climate that is preserved in Egypt that, say, isn't preserved in Mesopotamia in quite the same way. This is why we'll find, say, papyri, whereas, you know, you don't find any of that in Assyria. So there are differences between the two disciplines, and occasionally there's dialogue, but more often than not there isn't. Anyway, great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay, Michael Serber for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. You talked about when Genesis was most likely written. Do you think pre-Abraham stuff is inspired narrative or God revealing factual history to the author? And you expanded that question, so let's get the expansion as well. I wanted to expand that question, but can only use so many characters. I would have added if you think maybe the facts were simply passed down orally concerning flood, Genesis 6, etc. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think many of here's sort of what we kind of know about Genesis. It does seem to have been written during the Late Bronze Age. It has Egyptian vocabulary, and it has Egyptian vocabulary of a specific period. For example, you do find, like, the term pharaoh in Genesis. Well, all the events that occur in Genesis happened before pharaoh was coined as a term. It was coined during the reign of Thutmose III. So that was hundreds of years after the events of Genesis occurred. We also see many of sort of these retrojections in Genesis that show a modernization of the text for the reader of the Late Bronze Age. Okay, so you do find some Egyptian vocabulary in there. You do find, as I said earlier, references to Egyptian myth. And I said, and also, you do find these sort of references. So it's important to understand that the facts of what happened during, say, the period of Genesis were passed down over time. Now, does that mean it's not inspired? No. I think that the whole matter of inspiration is something that's really, really badly confused inside of the Christian church. I think one of the things about the doctrine of inspiration is we teach this one we teach really poorly. Okay. What goes into inspiration is not just, God communicating to man, but also the preparation that went into the man for God to use him. What jobs did he do? What was his upbringing? Who were his parents? What did he learn? What does he know? All of these things factor into God preparing the writer of Holy Scripture to do the task. And that's what we mean by inspiration, is that all these different factors play into it. So it isn't just that God gave the information. In fact, a lot of the times it isn't God giving the information. It's what God had prepared in the person to receive that information. So all of these things, basically the faith journey that every writer of Scripture had was divinely prepared for the task he was meant to do. So in that respect, Genesis is inspired Scripture. It just happens to be inspired using, things that were passed down, with the message that's updated for its current audience. Because by the time it was written, which was in the late Bronze Age, Pharaoh was the name for the king. Now, it wasn't that before then, it was just the king, but everyone in the Exodus knew the king of Egypt as Pharaoh, because that was, the normative title for the king of Egypt by that point. So the writer is going to use that, because that's what's done and that's what's important. Now, later on, say during the Book of Kings and Chronicles, when those are written, and those are basically edited during the exile, those books, you start seeing it revert back. So Pharaoh is no longer really called Pharaoh anymore. He's called the king of Egypt at that point. So we do find this updating of the text to meet the needs of his current readership. And we do this too. This is not at all uncommon. Most writers do this. Like, for example, we might talk about the pre-Columbian civilization of the Americas. Well, when it was pre-Columbian times, it wasn't called America. We use America as an updated term to communicate something retrospectively. And this is what's called a retrojection. So we do see a fair bit of this in Genesis, and it's indicative of when it was written, when the text was written. So thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate that question. I hope I answered it to your completely for you. Okay, $5 super chat from Ryan Naylor. Thank you very much. Would you rather collaborate with Niels Peter Lemke or Joel Kramer from ABR? Oh boy, you would have to answer that question. I'll be honest with you. I'll be honest with you. I'd rather collaborate with Lemke. To be very honest, at least I know where Lemke's coming from. I know Lemke is a biblical minimalist. Hey, if he wanted to have a two views, debate, fine. At least I know then what to expect from him. You know, and Lemke really hasn't changed his views at all. So, you know, he's at least consistent. With ABR, you're dealing with so many dirty tricks, subterfuge, you know, it just obfuscations. You don't know what you're getting. You really don't. And this is not a reflection on Joe Kramer, because I don't really know Joe Kramer. I've never seen any of his work. I've never read any of his work. But I know ABR, and I've had enough dealings with people from ABR to realize that it's never a pleasant experience. So that's all I'm going to say on that. But yeah, given the choice, I'll pick Lemke every time. But thank you very much for the super chat, even if you did mean it tongue-in-cheek. Okay. Matthew Harrell for $5. I can't find the creation myth where Thoth speaks creation into existence. Where do I find this? And doesn't this make Thoth theologically like Yahweh? Okay. You'll find this in the Memphite theology. It's also it's on a stone in the British Museum called the Shabako stone. Okay, it's a big black stone, and it was actually, once, to be honest, after it was used, it records basically a copy. It's actually a copy of a papyrus that was found in an archive, and then during the Third Intermediate period, it was then copied down. Let's see, Shabakta. Dates. So he's around 716 to 702 BC, and he commissions this copying, and this is Dynasty 25. So we're talking about the Kushite or Nubian kings. So he commissions the copying of this papyrus onto this stone, and what it does is it talks about this sort of theological contest between the what's called the Heliopolitan theology versus the Memphite theology. Now, the Heliopolitan theology is the cult of Re. He's the sun god, and it's this contest of theologies, and it's basically the Memphites saying, my theology is better because my creation story is better. Now, the Heliopolitan theology uses the sun god Re creates by, how do I say this without getting demonetized? The male sex act. Yeah, that's how he does it. Whereas the god Thoth thinks something and it is, speaks and it comes into existence. So the argument being made in this inscription is that because Thoth's method of creation is more refined, it's a better theology and more likely to be true. Now, this does this make Thoth theologically like Yahweh? Yes. Yes, it does. Does it make him the same? No. Heck no. Thoth is not a eternal being. Okay? Thoth created himself. So, Thoth did not exist back through all eternity. He just one day thought himself into existence, and he was. Okay? So he's not the same as Yahweh. Thoth lives in the created world, the world he spoke into existence. That's where he resides. He's an immanent God. Yahweh created for 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested from it. Yahweh is a transcendent God. So, is there a similarity? Yeah, sure. Are they the same? No, not even close. They're so radically different. Thoth is also a humaniform mummy, too. He has a physical form. He's shaped like a mummy. You know? So, we don't have a body for Yahweh. He's not a physical being in that sense. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Alrighty, we got one here from Biblical Theca Historica for $5. Thank you very much. Was Amenmeses contemporary with Seti the First? As a side, it seems Carbon-14 has ruled out Mesopotamian chronologies not within 10 years of the Middle Chronology. Okay, I'm going to be I'm very careful about Carbon-14. Okay, Carbon-14 is very problematic in the ancient Near East. It's very problematic. And we're still not exactly sure why. But part of the issue is that trees in the Middle East don't form annual rings in the same way as say in the northern or the deep southern hemispheres. Okay, there's just a real problem with this. It's a ring could represent, single ring on a tree can represent many years. We also have an issue with the that there's also some potential for being a carbon sink in the Middle East too, which also doesn't make matters any easier. So Carbon-14 is deeply problematic in the for dating anything in the ancient Near East. Now, I do use Carbon-14. Carbon-14 still has its uses, but its uses are better served as a form of relative dating. So you can put one date before one object before another in time by using the relative dating of Carbon-14, but it's simply not accurate enough. Like for example, in Egypt for the late Bronze Age, it can be off by 125, 150 years. So you know that's going to be a huge issue if you're trying to use a granularity of 10 years. You know, even for the Iron Age, it can be out by 50 to 75 years. So there's some issues here that really need to be addressed before we can take Carbon-14 as absolute dating. Now, I know the dendrochronologists want to force everyone to use their absolute dating. Those guys have got a hammer and they see every problem as a nail. And the history doesn't matter. I was at a paper once at Azor where Hendrix Bruins, and he's a really famous dendrochronologist. He's one of the leading dendrochronologists out there. You know, he made this statement that, you know, we should all abandon, conventional chronology and go with dendrochronology instead, based on Carbon-14. And, then he said the most preposterous statement that I heard, which was that the Hyksos dynasty ceased to be 100 years before Akhmosa the First. Well, if they ceased to be, who was Akhmosa the First conquering? This is just bizarre. It's so strange. It's so out of touch with, say, the history of the ancient Near East. So I really cannot take Carbon-14 as being credible for anything. Now, as far as Seti the Second is concerned, yes, they were contemporary. Amenmesa looks like he did establish a coup, essentially, to establish his own reign, and then he was ousted by Seti the Second. So that seems to be what happened was, there does seem to be this sort of civil war, for lack of a better word, a small civil war that happened in Egypt during this time, between Amenmeses and Seti the Second. So they were contemporary, but Seti the Second also reigns after Amenmeses. So more or less, Seti the Second is declared king but can't take the throne. He's ousted by Amnesis and then has to, fight his way back to it. So that seems to be what's going on here. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, we are done with the super chats again. So let's go back to regular questions. Okay. I've answered. I'll answer this one. It's not a super chat. Actually, maybe I won't answer that one. Okay, I'll answer Swiftsy. Hey, Dr. Falk, I don't have a scholarly question. Oh, yes, you do. This is a scholarly question. But I am a teenage Christian in high school, and I want to study biblical theology in Christian college. What are some things to expect? Okay. For most people who are going to Christian college, it can be a really great experience. It can also be a terrible experience. One of the things is, if you go to a Christian college, you do still need to very, very much attend to your faith. Okay? Because one of the problems with a lot of Christian college, especially if you are, say, an undergrad, this is less true for graduate students, but as an undergrad, a lot of Christian colleges will put on restrictions that you wouldn't experience at home. And a lot of people don't expect this coming into a Christian college and are not prepared for it. Like, there's one particular Christian college I know where, boys can't sit beside girls. They restrict what television shows you watch, what radio shows you're listening to, filter your internet, have a curfew. You have to be back in your dorm by 8 p.m. Crazy stuff you wouldn't have to go through even if you were living at home. They determine how that men have to be clean shaven and have to have short hair. Women have to wear skirts. There's all this sort of strange stuff that can happen at a Christian college that causes people to end up saying enough's enough. Christianity isn't worth this, and they leave the faith. Rather than giving them a good, sound education to begin with. So that is a problem that can be experienced at a Christian college. So it is really going to depend on which Christian college, and I think you need to really, really choose that carefully, because a lot of people go to Christian college. A lot of parents send their kids to Christian college thinking that this is going to make their child stand fast in the ways of the Lord, and oftentimes it ends up doing the opposite. I knew a friend. I have a friend who worked at a college, where in that college he was sort of the exit counselor. Basically, he basically talked to students and recently ex-students who left the faith after attending 4 years at this college, at this Christian college. And if I said which college it was, everyone would know it. It would recognize it instantly. But the statistics are really high. The statistics are enormously high. I mean, almost half to 80%, it's still kind of unclear how many, leave the faith after going to this particular college, just because it provides such an unrealistic environment of real life. So But then again, too, the fact is, even in something, a good Christian college, one that doesn't put those stressors on you, can also be very, very stressful, too. Okay? It can be an incredibly stressful environment to be in. Like, for example, for those getting a Master's of Divinity degree, this is the professional degree for becoming a pastor. Half the recipients of an MDiv degree get divorced within a year after. And that's just because you're doing this for such a long period of time, sacrificing so much. It's very stressful. So you have to be firmly grounded before you go to a Christian college. You should be firmly grounded before you go to any college, because this is not unique to Christian colleges. It also happens in secular colleges, where people will go, be taught a certain way in their churches. They might have a narrow view of inspiration, or they might have been taught young earth creationism or whatever. And they go to a secular college, and the professor plays pin the tail on the naive Christian, and it's a fun game for the professor, but it kind of sucks for the Christian. So many people have lost their faith that way too. Bible college can be a great way of ruining your faith. Now, the flip side is, it's also, if you avail yourself of every activity, and I mean, in that meaning, scholarly activity, studying, learning things. That's the reason you're there, after all. It can be a great experience too. It was for me. Christian college was an incredibly good experience for me. But then again, I treated the act of scholarship and the act of study as an act of worship. And that for me made all the difference. Because a lot of people will, you're doing translations of Greek texts, and your notes are like that thick. I mean, you're putting a lot of work into this stuff. So if all you're doing is just translating and going through commentaries and slogging through it, it can be miserable. But if you treat that like an act of worship, something God can use in your life to allow you to see more in the scriptures, wow, it can be a tremendously rewarding and fulfilling experience. And it was some of the greatest days of my life, was going to seminary, because I treated it in this way. But it's not easy if you do it right. It's the culture can be very difficult if you come from a home with more freedom. But it can also be exceptionally rewarding. I highly recommend it. But again, do it with your eyes wide open. Understand what the culture of the college is like. Because the culture of the college will probably determine more about how much you get out of it than anything else. So anyway, that's my advice for this. Thank you very much for the question. Best of luck. Okay. Do we have any more super chats? Let's see. Okay, we have another super chat from Matthew Harrell. $5. Thank you very much. Last question for now. Oh, really? Promises. I like your questions. Your questions are great. Was temple prots among the Canaanites meant to be something sacred, or was it prosaic by their own account, and was it rampant? I'm trying not to get defunded here. Okay, was temple prosaic among the Canaanites? Yes, it was. Was it meant to be something sacred, or on its own account? This is a very controversial question, okay? Now, if you'd asked a scholar back in the 19th century, was it sacred or was it just sex? Okay. Every scholar would answer, oh, it was so sacred. It was a sacred rite. Well, you ask scholars today, and they'll answer the opposite. And a lot of that is, it was basically an exchange of favors for money. Essentially, that's basically what this sort of temple rite was. Now, why do we have this view today? I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that in the 21st century, we are much more like the Canaanites than the scholars in the 19th century were. So, because we're more like the Canaanites today, we can sort of understand what the true motivation was behind it. And it was essentially, more of its own account. And it was not meant to be sacred. Now, was it rampant? That's a fine question. And we don't exactly know how rampant it was. So some of it is that it probably was not as rampant as we think it was. Like, for example, some Greek temples, even those that were, say, dedicated to sex, those temples did not have these sort of activities. Those sort of activities were considered to be forbidden within the temple. So it was actually a lot less common. It seems to have been more. It seems to have taken place more along the side of a temple. So it wasn't usually done inside a temple, even in say Canaanite temples. It was really more done. They would build like a building beside it, where these fundraising activities would take place. And you would go, you'd pay your amount of silver. There would be an exchange of goods, and then you would go to the regular temple and do your regular sacrifices, however it was accomplished. So there was that sort of separation even then between those activities and what happened within the sacred precincts of the temple itself. So Matthew Harrell, $2. Sorry to do that to you. Well, I guess I'll forgive you this time. It's a really good question, though. I mean, I'm just you're just sort of battling YouTube's community guidelines, which are vaguely defined at best. So, but it is actually a very important historical question. It's a really important historical question, and we don't have. It's not one historical question that's taught well, because we also can't speak plainly about it. So I'm trying to give you a really good answer to this question too, because it is. I think it's an excellent question. It's one that speaks a lot to Canaanite religion, how they viewed divinity, how they viewed these acts. And so it's an important question. It is really an important question, because it comes down to culture and worldview. So and also our perception of that worldview. That's really important too. Because even though we're more like them, than say our 19th century predecessors, we also misunderstand a lot of what that was like too. Like, for example, you'll see skeptics saying, oh, it was so much better back in the Canaanite days because they were sexual libertines. Well, they weren't sexual libertines. Far from it. They had restrictions on sex just like every culture does. So, they weren't libertines any more than our culture today at large is libertine. Every culture, cultures of over time history universally across the planet have disagreed over, you know, say sexual practices, how many wives one has, but every culture has maintained that you cannot take any woman you want. This is a human universal. Okay? No culture has ever permitted that. So to suggest that the Canaanites were libertines is just ridiculous. You know, it flies in the face of history. It flies in the face of what we know from these cultures, and it just flies in the face of human universals. So it's actually a fabulous question. It's actually one of the better questions I've been asked, and I think it's a really, really good question. And I just think it's a shame that we can't talk a little more plainly about it. But I think I gave you a sense of how that works in Canaan, and how it's sort of you know, how we best understand it today. Anyway, thank you for the super chat and the apology. Okay. All right, RG Strategy, $5. Thank you very much. I'm here, late, but here. Well, glad you're here. More of a personal question. In your opinion, who is favorite ancient Egyptian king to study? Oh, wow. Well, I mean, I'm a big Ramses II guy. Okay, I think Ramses II is incredibly fascinating, but you know, King Tutankhamun, you know, left us so much stuff that it's hard not to. It's sort of a toss up. You know, Tutankhamun didn't have an eventful reign, but the stuff he sort of left us gave us just so much fodder to study. It isn't even funny. So there's pleasure to be had in either type of study. Now, again, I like Ramses. I think Ramses. I love the Battle of Kadesh. I'm a big fan of studying him as a character study. So there's a lot of things go to recommend Ramses II, but there's a lot of great kings in the New Kingdom. So you know, you can't just limit it to one. I mean, I have to admit, I've always also loved the reading the annals of Tutmosis III. Here's a very, very interesting character in Egyptian history. Exceptionally interesting. He's essentially, you know, he comes to the throne at age 6. His stepmom becomes regent, you know, essentially then usurps the throne. And then she sends him off to the equivalent of military school, where he becomes very proficient at war. So you got this very, very interesting dynamic going on. And there's a lot of these sort of things that happen in Egyptian history. So, you know, I can really understand people. I mean, there isn't one favorite across the board. Every Egyptologist is going to have their favorite. I had a professor at University of Toronto who really loved Senwosret III, Middle Kingdom pharaoh, or Middle Kingdom king. I don't care for Senwosret III. I don't find him that interesting, but the professor really enjoyed him. So, you know, it's a matter of taste, and it is a personal question. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it, and thank you for the question. Okay, Ryan Naylor for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Favorite bad guy girl? Ooh. Set, Ammit, Apophis, or Mum-Ra? Okay, I'm gonna give you a really different answer here. Sekhmet. Sekhmet is a very, very bad girl. Okay? She's also a very good girl. Now, we have to understand in Egyptian religion, gods were not good or evil, they were both. Every god had a good side and a bad side. So gods in ancient Egypt had these dualistic personalities. And Set isn't an evil god, he's a god of power. You know, power to create, power to destroy. Amit is sort of a kind of a placeholder there to eat souls. She doesn't really do much, and it is a female, so that crocodile, hippo, lion combo thing is actually a girl. So she's a girl, and we don't know much about her, but you do see her a lot in iconography. The Apopus serpent, well, again, kind of a placeholder for the eating of the sun. So, very, very interesting, but Sekhmet. I like Sekhmet. Sekhmet is a lion goddess, daughter of Re. What she does is she inflicts people with disease. And she's accompanied by a horde of 1,000 demons that go out and inflict people with disease. At the Temple of Mut at Karnak, there were over 1,000 statues of Sekhmet erected there by Amenhotep III. Egyptologists believes that Amenhotep III was not very healthy. So the way you try to get the gods to heal you in ancient Egypt is you pray to Sekhmet. And you ask Sekhmet to remove the disease she put upon you. So she didn't heal you, she withdrew the disease she gave you in the first place. So she's sort of my favorite baddie here, because it's not the sort of healing goddess you find in most myth cultures. It's really unique. So it's a great question. My hat goes to Sekhmet. Thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciated. Wow. Yeah, it's a great question too. Yeah. Okay. Fetching Mitch for 100 Australian. Wow. Thank you for that very generous super chat. Man, looks like I'm going to catch up on another live stream going bowling today. Bowling's great. Why not? At least I can donate this time. Thank you again. Quick question. Which is Moses' greater bowling achievement? Sparring the 7 to 10 Red Sea split or striking 10 coming down from Mount Sinai? Well, that's a great question, even if couched in bowling terms. Now, frankly, I understand the appeal to bowling, but I've never actually been bowling myself. So, yes, that's correct. I've never been bowling. I've never actually done it. So there's you got a personal piece of personal trivia. I've never bowled. So, but the greater achievement is it's a hard to evaluate which one here is greater. The splitting of the Red Sea, I mean, both these come from God. So it's really not even Moses' achievement, it's God's achievement. But if you say, okay, the splitting of the Red Sea saved the children of Israel from being slaughtered by the Egyptians and the chariot army of the Egyptians. So without that, you wouldn't have the 10 Commandments. That wouldn't happen come today. But without the 10 Commandments, you wouldn't have much of a foundation, at least not an equal, our foundation for, say, modern legal jurisprudence wouldn't be the same. There'd be differences. So it's a tough call. You know, you look at, say, Christianity, you know, what are the big 3 events of Christianity? Well, the biggest one is unquestionably the crucifixion and resurrection. That's number one. That no one even questions that within Christian circles. The crucifixion and the resurrection. But number 2 is the Exodus. And number 3 is the giving of the law at Sinai. You look at, say, the Old Testament. It has hundreds of references to, did I not lead you out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm? By the way, that mighty hand and outstretched arm is an allusion to how Egyptian kings were shown. If you go to temples in Egypt, one of the interesting things you see there is Pharaoh, and he's got one arm stretched out, and in his hand he's clutching the hair of Asiatics or Libyans or some enemy, and in the other arm's raised with a mace in it, ready to club him. So this is where we get the term with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand, or mighty hand and outstretched arm. You know, it's an Egyptian reference. So we do kind of have to give it to the Exodus as being sort of maybe a smidge greater thing than, say, the law at the Mount Sinai, but they're both incredibly important. You know, it's like pick your favorite doctrine. You know, it's like, well, they're all important. You know, they're all important. You know, pick salvation, which is more important, the Trinity or salvation by grace through faith? Well, they're both important. You have to have them both. You can't judge one or the other. Okay, so it's kind of like that. It's like, you know, Star Wars or Star Trek. You know, it's like, yes, both. Not to reduce it to a science fiction analogy, but yeah, it's there. Both events are exceptionally important, and our understanding of them are absolutely necessary. And I think we need to teach these more. You know, get back into that Old Testament, because without that Old Testament, we become Marcionites. And if we become Marcionites, we start thinking about, you know, God, the good God of the New Testament, and the bad God of the Old Testament. Well, no, that's wrong. You know, the God of the Old Testament is good. You see this in, say, the giving of the law, where Yahweh says, you know, unto those who curse me, you know, I will curse for you know 3 or 4 generations, but unto those whom I bless, I will bless for 1,000 generations. You know, there is that sort of overflowing of goodness in the Old Testament, but we don't know our Old Testament anymore. So I think it's a fun question to speculate, but it's really impossible to say which one's more important. But if it comes to, if you came right down to say, well, which one does God emphasize more in the Old Testament, then you'd have to say that God emphasizes more the Exodus than the giving of the law. But the law is really important too, because that's what defines our sin, and that's what shows that we're fallen beings and that we are hopelessly lost without Jesus Christ. So you need them both. But anyway, thank you for that incredibly generous super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, and I think we are at the end of our time. We have gone for an hour and a half here. And I think I've covered all the super chats, and we've even taken many non-super chats tonight. So it's a bit. Take 1 or 2 more. Okay, I've. Let's see. Okay, I'll take this one here because it's a quick one. I can answer this one real quickly. From Gizgo SBOL. Did ancient Egyptian music have similar microtonal qualities as more modern Egyptian and North African musical traditions? We're not sure, but probably not. It didn't have the modern Western scale of music. but it also was very much affected by the kind of instrumentation it had. Okay, so it had a lyre, it had sistrum, but it didn't have any of the modern stringed instruments like the oud. Much of modern Egyptian music is influenced by the development of the oud and by the drums they used and that sort of thing. So it's not likely that they had that same sort of microtonal qualities that you find in, say, North African traditions. It seems to have had its own tradition, but it's impossible to say for sure, but I think it's likely not. But it's a great question. Thank you very much for asking that. Okay. One you want to know? Black wigs or other colors? Actually, there's one also I want to answer to. I can't. Who said the black wigs? I see it. Young spiritual warrior. Okay, young spiritual warrior. Were Egyptian wigs only black, or were there other colored wigs? The ones that sort of have survived them, we do find them in certain burials. And it's really hard to say for certain, but they generally were black, or at least brownish. So you don't find blonde wigs, and you don't find, say, much in the way of, say, red-headed wigs, although we do find Egyptians with red hair. So amongst the natural coloration of ancient Egyptians, we find natural hair color going from red, like, for example, Ramses II was a redhead. We find some then we find a gradation of coloration from brown to black, but most of the wigs are black. So there might have been. We also don't know too if some of that, if the color that they used was color fast either. So it's hard to know when we look at, say, the wigs that were recovered, how much of that is its original coloration as well. So we have to keep that in mind as well. But it seems to be that they were mostly black, and women wore wigs, and they wore wigs because they shaved their heads as lice protection. So there was actually a cleanliness reason why they did it. So because lice was terrible in ancient Egypt. We have evidence of lice combs going all the way back to the pre-dynastic period. These beautiful little ivory combs that have been cut just for the extraction of lice. But even that was eventually not enough, and eventually the Egyptians, men and women, took to shaving their body hair. So that's why they wore wigs. They also used the wigs for another purpose too, which was for perfume cones. Sometimes women would wear these perfume cones on the top of their wig, and the body heat would cause the perfume to melt and to give off a fragrance. So the wig actually served more than one purpose. So it was both a replacement for natural hair, and it was also a kind of a perfume dispenser. So very interesting question. Okay, and there was another one I wanted to take because I saw it here. Okay, I'm going to take this one from Justin Hall, and this will probably be our last question for the night. All right, would you explain how Egyptians viewed the soul and their whole being? Okay. The Egyptians viewed the person as being many different parts, for lack of a better word. There were it wasn't a body soul dichotomy. Okay, there was each of these parts I'm about to mention made a living, vital part of the whole person, and you weren't complete as a person without all of these. So of course you have the body, okay, that goes without saying. You then had the ka, which is the spirit, and then you had the ba, and the ba is different from the ka. One is a spirit, the other is more of your will, your rational, assertive will. So you had the ba and the ka, and they were different. Okay, so you had two you had two sort of spirit kind of things, for lack of better, spirits that were part of the human being. Okay, but it gets more complicated than that, because they also had placed phenomenological attributes on other aspects of the human being as well, like your name. Your name had a living presence. Your shadow had a living presence. You know, it was part of you. So the human being was very, very the whole human being in Egyptian thought is actually quite complex. Your heart was different too. Okay, so there's all these different aspects. You have the ba, you have the ka, you have the ib, which is the heart, you have the shadow, and you have your name, and then you got your body. So it's complicated. It's a very, very complex idea of what makes up a human being. So it's a very interesting question, and a lot of study has been done on this, especially the ka, because we find ka chapels all over the place in Egypt. So I think that should give you at least some idea of how Egyptians viewed the soul and the whole being. Now, when you died, the ka and the ba went to the afterlife. So did the ib, the heart. The rest of it, you know, stayed on Earth to be mummified, buried, etc. Okay? So this is a very complex relationship between our parts and aspects, which is also one of the reasons, too, why, you know, when they wanted to get exact revenge on somebody in the afterlife, they scrubbed out people's names. Okay? This was because the Egyptians believed that names also had real spiritual presence. When a person's name was rubbed out from, say, their inscriptions or their monuments, it was destroying an aspect that made that person complete. This is why the damnatio memoriae was so considered such a devastating thing to do to somebody, was because it basically rubbed out a piece of the human being. So anyway, thank you for that question. That question was very, very interesting. Okay, and I think we're gonna call it a night. So anyway, we've gone for an hour 40 minutes. I want to thank everyone who gave a super chat. Thank you very much for watching this live stream. Some very, very interesting questions tonight. This was very enjoyable. A lot of really great questions. Oh. One more slipped in at the 11th hour. Okay. Dante's Power for $5. Believer, what is the most compelling evidence for the Bronze Age historicity of the Bible? Well, really, when we're talking Bronze Age, we're really just talking about the Pentateuch, Joshua, and Judges, really. And I think the most compelling evidence has to be the vocabulary found in the Pentateuch. That Egyptian vocabulary is very, very distinct to the Egyptian 19th dynasty. So you can, at that point, Benjamin Noonan did a incredible work on non-Semitic loanwords in the Bible. Incredible work. It's unfortunately, the book's ghastly expensive, but it's very good. So I highly recommend his work. But I think that's an incredible, compelling and persuasive for me evidence of when specific books in the Bible were written. And we have to admit, some of them were written, during the Late Bronze Age. Some of them were written during the Babylonian exile, and a few were written after the Babylonian exile. So we're not going to be hard and fast on this, but we are going to have to say, okay, there are pieces to this that are definitely really old. I'd say probably the second most compelling evidence, it has to be the toponyms. The toponyms are one of those things that can really be easily dated. So that is a piece of evidence that I think is particularly persuasive for the late Bronze Age writing of, say, the Pentateuch. At least the core sections of it. There's always the possibility that there was some sort of stitching together, and I think that's highly likely that the core documents were written during the late Bronze Age, but later on stitched together in one long work during the early monarchy. So that's sort of where I think it stands. So, but anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. And even though it is a very last minute one, we took it anyway.
Yeah, people took $10 of this. Can we take another non-super chat?
Yeah, sure. I'll take another non-super chat of yours. Does he have one more question here?
It's the same one. So he said that you're answering. So can you choose one of my previous non-super chats?
All right, let me go check. Okay, let me see what I can find here from Dante's. Okay, I see one question. That wouldn't be a good use. Let's see if I can find a better one. Yeah, I see your DNA question. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot on that. It's compelling. Well, let's raise that question and I'll see if you got it in better.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll pick it then. Rather you have an answer, and basically, even if I tell you I don't know, than not to answer it. Okay. Question: what is the most compelling DNA or genetic evidence that proves the historicity of the Bible? Now, DNA evidence has not been terribly good at this. And the problem comes down to preservation, archaeological preservation. The problem is that the Israelites who became, say, Jews in the rabbinic period, a lot of them went to Europe and they intermarried. So a lot of the bloodline, the genetic material that we find in, say, modern Jews is essentially European. It's mostly white, Eastern and Western European genetic material. So that doesn't actually help us much. The second is the way the Israelites buried their dead did not lead to long-term preservation. Which is what they did was they put them in these limestone caves. Well, one of the problems with limestone for the archaeologist is limestone. We use the term sarcophagus to mean a stone casket, but a sarcophagus is actually more than a limestone or a stone casket. It comes from, I don't know if it's Greek or Latin. I think it's Greek. Sarcophagus, meaning flesh eating. Okay, a sarcophagus is a kind of coffin that eats your flesh, and the reason it does that is because of the limestone that's found in a lot of sarcophagi. that limestone quickly deteriorates the flesh in the same way that lye does, because it's basic. So what the Israelite burial tradition is, especially when you talk about, say, is the 1st century BC, was to lay the dead in these limestone caves for the flesh to be eaten away. And then what they would do is come back, say, 3 to 5 years later, collect the bones, and then put them in these ossuaries. Well, the problem is, under those circumstances, very little genetic material remains. Israeli archaeology has not been particularly successful in finding a lot of good DNA evidence. Okay, so we do have some problems with that sort of finding of DNA evidence. We do find a lot of bones. We do find a lot of osteological remains. Now, the osteological remains are very interesting, because we do find things such as the widespread consumption of pig in say certain places in Israel that you shouldn't be finding it. So there are some things that we can get out of remains, but DNA is generally not one of them. We do find more of this in Egypt because the Egyptians mummified, and that preserved a lot of DNA. So we do actually have a lot of DNA evidence from Egypt. The problem is, for your question, is not directly relevant to the Bible. It's just really, really interesting and really good supporting material. Now, in Egypt, we have a different problem with the genetic material, which is we often do genetic testing on kings, where there happens to have been, basically close family lines, and this muddles the DNA of so we don't know exactly who is related to whom, as it were. So I hope that gives you sort of a broad overview of the question. I'm sorry YouTube ate your $10. Man, YouTube can be really, really, really flaky at times. So, and I'm expecting to have some fun with the community guidelines after this live stream. So I'm going to feel your pain here. Okay. Okay. And there's one last super chat, and this has got to be the last super chat from Mouthwash for 6 Israeli shekels. Thank you very much. I'm glad you could actually join us. It doesn't feel like a live stream without you, Mouthwash. Okay. Do you know any good historical fiction set in Egypt? Regrettably, no, I don't. I don't actually read a lot of historical fiction. So for me, I read a lot of science fiction. I mean, I'm really much more of a science fiction than a historical fiction reader. So for me, I don't really actually know much in the way of good historical fiction set in Egypt. So unfortunately, I can't give you an answer to that question. Geez, Stargate, is a great science fiction that has some Egypt in it. Okay, but I wouldn't say it's good historical fiction. So again, I just don't read much in that genre. So for me, I actually do what's it called now? I'm actually more into, say, the genres of, say, music and science fiction and video games. Assassin's Creed, that's a very, very realistic depiction of ancient Egypt, as far as I can tell. I still haven't gone very far in that game yet. Again, the reason why I haven't gone far in that game is it just feels too much like work, and I like to relax when I play my video games. So I haven't gotten as far into it as I wanted to, but that's probably all I can recommend for this. So with that, thank you very much for that super chat. And thank you for joining us. Okay, so with that said, we're going to call it a night. Thank you for all the super chats tonight. Thank you for a great set of questions. Wow, this was a really fantastic set of questions tonight. You guys outdid yourself. Thank you for all our subscribers, and thank you to our viewers. The viewers do help when people view these videos. They do help support the channel. And again, thank you to all my Patreon supporters and those who bought my book recently. And with that said, have a good night, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.